Welcome to RSP Film and Theory. Adam Harstad, Matt Waldman joining you on this lovely Thursday morning. Hopefully, those of you who were remaining in Florida are safe. And we'll eventually get to resume some of the activities that you enjoy. But obviously, for some of you, it may be a longer haul, and we hope the best for you, and for those of you who have family down there, and hopefully everything will be okay with them. And, we're going to move on to some things that are a lot more trivial, but hopefully will be fun for many of you and maybe take your mind off some of it. We're going to talk about players that we may expect to regress, both negatively and positively. Some who may actually return to value, who may dip below the value that they currently have and no longer are starters. And we're going to begin though with Adam's piece on exuberance and pessimism, and how we regard that as fantasy GMs competing together. So Adam, and then we may talk about a figure too at the end who has a birthday today, and kind of talk about players who excelled but maybe are problematic at some point, and file it under people are complicated. We'll just put it that way. So yeah, Adam, tell us a little bit about this week's piece on exuberance and pessimism.
Yeah, so it starts with one of my favorite observations, because it's pretty trivial to prove if you just think about it. So if you ask anybody in your league, if I ask you, all right, look at the 12 teams in your league and just give me your best guess. What are the odds they win the title this year? You're going to think about it and you're going to come up with some numbers. I don't know if they're good numbers. I don't know if they're bad numbers, but you know how probability works. So I bet you those 12 numbers are going to add up to 100%. That's how it works. There's going to be a winner this year. That's a certainty. So the odds should add up to 100%. If I did that for each of your 11 league mates as well, assuming that you're playing with people with like this basic probabilistic literacy, they're also going to give me sets of numbers that add up to 100%. But their numbers are going to be different than your numbers because they feel differently about the teams. That makes sense. If I then took those 12 sets of numbers and I looked at just each manager's projections for their own team's chances, it's pretty easy to prove that managers are higher on their players than everybody else in the league is, because otherwise they would trade those players to someone else in the league. If you have Kyren Williams and you're not really a big Kyren Williams believer, you think it's all smoke and mirrors, you're going to trade him to somebody who is a big Kyren Williams believer, because there's not going to be any shortage of people out there who would love to acquire Kyren Williams at the rate he's producing right now. So for the most part, each manager is going to be among the highest on their own players, so they're naturally going to think that they have a better chance of winning than everybody else thinks. And so if I add up each manager's own estimate of their title odds, I get a total that sums up to pretty significantly north of 100%. So each individual owner creates these estimates that are internally consistent. But when you look at the subset of each estimate, you get something that's not internally consistent. And so the owners, as a whole, overrate their chances of winning the title. And this is an insight that potentially can be actionable in Dynasty. If everybody's overrating their title odds in aggregate, that should suggest that maybe future first-round picks are going to be undervalued, because people think that those picks, on average, are going to be later than they actually are statistically. Somebody's going to get the number 1 overall pick, and only one person's going to get that number 12. There might be 4 people who think they're getting the number 12, but only one of them's right.
But what if?
So it's an old observation of mine. It's one of my favorite ones, because it's one of those things that is true and is obviously true, and you don't really have to do any work. And the less work I can do, the happier I am. So I wrote this up 10 years ago, and I said, if everybody's irrationally exuberant, and the phrase comes from an old Alan Greenspan quote about bubbles in the economy. If there's this bubble on win probability, maybe the solution is just a little bit of calculated pessimism. Whatever you think about your team's chances, maybe just downwards by some set amount. Maybe be 10% more pessimistic on your team, and then that'll get you to the right place.
Well, he was paid to be rationally exuberant. We can say that about him. God.
Yeah, I'm not. I was. A quote is an endorsement of the quote. It's
Right.
not an endorsement of the person, and we're going to touch on that later in the episode. That I think it's a great quote.
Yeah, it is.
But a quote is an endorsement of the quote itself.
I am rationally exuberant about having the first round number 1 overall pick in a couple of leagues this year, I must say, Adam. So
you think? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm feeling pretty rationally exuberant about my pessimism. So
it is funny too. When you think about it that way too, that basically you're going to be irrationally exuberant towards your own goals. But you're right that different teams are going to have different goals, and so there's probably, thinking about it, there might be like a two-sided irrational exuberance where everybody thinks they're drafting first or last, and nobody thinks they're getting one of those middle of the round picks. But I don't know. In every season I've seen so far, somebody has wound up picking sixth. I don't know. Maybe this year will be the year that bucks the trend, and everybody's drafting top 3 and bottom 3. We'll have to see.
I have had a season where me and someone else somehow ended up both being champions, but that was that weird 2020 season where we had that. So maybe but that's exceptional. Anyway,
I was in the title game that year, and I had Chase and Higgins both going in that game. And so, the commissioner was talking about like what's you guys' preferred resolution, talking to the participants. What is you guys' preferred resolution? And what we wound up with is, the guy who's ahead. I was unlikely to make the comeback. Like if you're looking at it probabilistically, he was probably going to win. It wasn't to the point where he was certainly going to win. It was definitely within the realm of possibility. There'd been like 3 weeks where Higgins and Chase had combined for enough to overcome the gap. But this guy's ahead, and I have no problem saying like, okay, let's just call him the winner. And then we wound up splitting the pot. He was out in Vegas, and so we're like, oh, we'll just meet up and do a dinner with the winnings. My proposal was like, how about we say probabilistically what the odds of the comeback were, and then we each get like that share of the championship. So like henceforth, I'm going to call myself, say I won 0.3 titles that year. So that was my preferred resolution. The other people weren't as into fractional championships. I think they were more likely to. But honestly, like having 2 championships screws up the numbers in the analysis a lot more than having 7/10 and 3/10 of a championship split between the two participants. Yeah. I know I'm an oddball on that. I doubt very many other people were advocating for fractional championships, but that's really, I think, the best solution in that situation.
That's awesome. So what about the pessimistic side of things?
So to me, that 10 years ago, that was the obvious solution, that like if everybody is overrating their chances by 10%, just put like a global 10% reduction, and that'll get you to the right point. What's the harm? What could be the harm of just a little bit of calculated pessimism? And I'm revisiting it now, and I'm like, well, actually, there can be a lot of harm. I saw a team, in 2017, a team in one of my leagues started 0-4. And that at 0-4, that's the time where you're thinking like, hey, maybe I pivot and start looking for next year. But he felt he had a competitive team, and he just gotten unlucky. Continued competing, wound up finishing 6-7, made the playoffs on tiebreakers, and then had the best playoff run of any team in our league's history, won the title. If that manager had been just a slight bit more pessimistic, maybe that title doesn't happen. I have a team this year where I'm 1-4. But again, the fundamentals are strong. I'm 3rd in the league in points. I've had just really bad schedule luck. Footballguys projects me 2nd going forward. And I'm like, okay, being 1-4 makes the path forward harder, but I still think I have a reasonable chance. I'm definitely going to continue contending. I'm not at all playing for next year at this point. It makes the path harder, but I think that's still the right play. Whereas a bit of calculated pessimism, maybe I'm saying, maybe it's time to throw in the towel. I think a lot of times it might be to a manager's benefit to manage their team as if they're better than they really are. That might be, there's a lot of potential harm to being too pessimistic. So I said, it was one of my favorite pieces when I wrote it 10 years ago. And now I'm just going to have to disagree with my past self, which is, it's good. If I ever get to a point where I'm reading old stuff and not disagreeing with myself, that means I've kind of, died to the entire idea of growth as an analyst. So this time I'm saying, like, okay, if being too optimistic is bad, but being too pessimistic is also bad, maybe the solution is just to be perfectly accurate in your estimates of team strength. Like, maybe that's what we should try to do, is just stop making any mistakes and just be perfect and objectively correct. That I think should be the goal. But also recognizing that this is a pretty hard goal. Maybe a acceptable workaround would be making decisions in a way where it doesn't really matter what our estimate of the team quality is. And that's one of the reasons I like my approach, where, my goal in Dynasty is just build the best team that I can. And if I do a good job at that, I trust that the wins are going to follow. So for me, I have a 1-4 team. I have a 4-1 team. My goal is still the same. I'm trying to make my team better tomorrow than it was today. And I'm going to try and make it better the day after that than it is tomorrow, regardless of the record. And to the extent that we can divorce these considerations from any estimates, it doesn't matter how accurate or inaccurate our estimates are.
So yeah, I like that. But let me ask you a question about your goal. With this, could you also maybe amend it to say, maybe the answer is to know yourself enough to know whether you are by nature overly exuberant or overly pessimistic, and maybe as an exercise go the opposite direction a little bit as an exercise to work towards that. So it's like, instead, like the goal is to be accurate, but maybe also like the subheading of that goal is, in order to do that, let me stretch myself emotionally in the opposite direction of what I normally am. So like, if you're 0-4 and you're usually like, I just had some bad breaks, and and I normally see myself as in that overly exuberant realm, maybe I say, instead of waiting like till week 6 or 7 to start or start week until week 9 or 10 to be panicky, maybe I start looking at things a little bit more dour in a couple weeks if things don't change, and try and make a pivot from a more pessimistic angle. Or if I'm normally pessimistic at 0-4, let me try and look at some things that I can justify as real positives here, and try and compete with what I have, and go that route. I don't know, something where you can kind of use it as a reverse barometer for your for what you normally are, so that you can stretch a little bit. Maybe that'll bring you to the center a little bit better.
Yeah, I'm a sucker for the classics, and know thyself is actually like the first Delphic maxim carved above the entrance to the Temple of Apollo, because the Greeks considered this is the number one goal: know thyself. This is what you need to do. So yeah, great. Like, know thyself. I'm a big fan of that. And I also think it's good and important that everybody has their own approaches, and everybody has their own, everybody's finding what works for them, especially in something like Dynasty, where it's not going to be a solved game. It's harder to say that there's a right approach and a wrong approach compared to redraft, where the goals are so much more narrowly defined that, we're never going to get to the point where this is objectively right, this is objectively wrong, but we can get to a point where we can say, like, yes, this is much more likely to increase your chances, and this is much less likely to increase your chances. So yeah, I'm a big fan of know thyself. I'm not ever going to argue against that. For me personally, anytime there's a chance I can screw something up, I'm going to screw it up some percentage of the time.
Right.
So as much as possible, I want my process to remove these surfaces that error can cling to. I want to bypass that route entirely. And so that's why I say I like managing my team in ways where it doesn't matter what my record is or what my chances are. If this trade makes me better, I'm going to do it, whether I'm 1-4 or 4-1. And this isn't ideal. There's obviously going to be some situations where it does depend. If I trade for Travis Kelce today, that it matters whether my team's 4-1 or 1-4. Like I do have to estimate title odds for that, because production only matters in competitive windows. And if I'm really not going to win this year, if my odds really are only 2%, any production load into the season has no value to me. In fact, it might even have negative value, because then I'm not going to be one of those 4 or 5 teams that end up with the number 1 overall pick this year. I might wind up being that rare team that actually finishes in the middle of the draft order. It's an ideal saying, get to a point where it doesn't matter. And it's never going to happen. It's not realistic. At some point, you do have to accurately estimate your odds. And if knowing yourself and adding a little calculated pessimism gets you to a more accurate estimate, or if maybe you're naturally a pessimistic person and adding a little bit of optimism gets you to a more accurate estimate, then do that. But I do think that managers don't really... They underestimate how often we can take these things out of the equation, and where possible, I would recommend doing so.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, speaking of optimism and pessimism, we're going to kind of explore some players that maybe we think are going to regress to the mean, or regress to the point of not having starter value. Let's say that. Like, who are some players that you just expect off top starts, but you think that they're going to probably, the league's going to adjust to a level that, or maybe there's some indicators of injuries or players missing or potential trades or some sort of issues that you think are going to contribute to that player no longer having starter value over the next month or two?
I have an advantage in this over you. Not because I'm better at this sort of thing, but because my process is a lot easier. So this is my big thing is that, like, my general heuristic is good players are going to produce, bad players aren't. So anytime we have a player who I don't think is that good who's producing, I'm not really going to delve into the situation and the context and everything leading to that production. I'm just going to say, I don't think he's as good as the numbers. I don't think they're going to continue. Sure. Whereas you actually have to break out the film and look at the scheme fit and, see if they've changed their approach to the game, or if they've developed some skills that maybe they didn't have in prior years. And that's a lot of work. That's very hard. I just get to skip that. That's nice. I operate... I always say my process is like 90% memes and whimsy. It's there's the saying that, like, what was it? The religion where it's like, oh, the world is all on the back of a giant turtle. It all stands on the back of a giant turtle. And then somebody says, well, what does that giant turtle stand on? And it says, oh, well, it's on the back of an even larger turtle. It's just turtles all the way down. And that's my process. It's just hand waves all the way down. So I could easily name some names.
Sure.
I did on Regression Alert, my column this week, I looked at yards per carry, which is one of my favorite ones to look at just because it's so random.
Right.
And this year has just given us just like a cornucopia of great examples of just how random it is. So, for instance, Gus Edwards, through 2022, had the 9th highest yards per carry in NFL history among a player with at least 500 carries. Like, Gus Edwards was the yard per carry running back in the NFL. This year, he's actually last in the league in yards per carry among players with at least 30 carries. Is that because Gus Edwards is a meaningfully worse player than he was 2 years ago? Or is that because yards per carry is basically a pseudo-random number generator, and he's just gotten some unlucky rolls of the dice to start?
Well, if you listen to half our analyst industry, they will tell you exactly how many miles per hour he's gained or lost with his burst or his speed based on their eyeball test. But that's another rant that I could make. But anyway,
but hey,
I wish I had that skill. That's all I could say.
I was about to say that's work. I get to just hand wave. See, they're suckers. They're putting in the work when all they really had to do was just kind of shrug their shoulders and say, eh.
That they
Yeah,
have superpowers. That's all I can say. Is they're all superhuman, and I'm just some schlub who's like working my ass off trying to figure out whether or not they have speed in the first place. But anyway, go ahead.
yeah. Hey, it's like I always say, Matt. I mean, it's a sucker's game, and
Yeah.
you're the sucker at the moment.
Yep, I am.
Or I mean, you've laughed. I know you've laughed about all the DeAndre Swift stuff this year, where like DeAndre Swift is the same guy he's always been. He's not a meaningfully different player at this stage in his career.
Yeah.
He's the guy who averaged 4.6 yards per carry over the first 4 years of his career. And then he opened up the first 3 games. He had one of the 10 lowest yard per carry averages in NFL history over the first 3 weeks of the season. And then he has like 5.8 yards per carry in the next game. You're reaching into a hat and pulling out, a slip of paper and saying, oh, his yards per carry today is going to be 7.6. Okay. It's not truly random because there is some repeatable component to yards per carry. It's not really the repeatable component that people think it is. A lot of people think that the thing that is leading to yards per carry is player talent to a first approximation. Good running backs get high yards per carry. Bad running backs get low yards per carry. And that's not what it is. It's a specific talent. It's a specific skill. And that specific skill is straight line speed. The difference between a 4.2 and a 4.8 yards per carry is once you get past that first level of defenders, are you able to run a 4.3 or a 4.5? If it's a 4.3, okay, great. This is a 70-yard gain. If it's a 4.5, okay, you're getting 20 yards. And that extra 50 yards is like a 0.3 or 0.4 difference in a player's yard per carry average. Most running backs who finish above the league average in yards per carry at the end of the year, you only have to take away 1 or 2 runs to get them below league average for the year. So backs like Le'Veon Bell or Frank Gore or Matt Forte, later career Frank Gore, post-injury Frank Gore. I know, I don't know if you're going to throw that out there where before the injuries, he had a lot more athleticism. But the Frank Gore that people think about when I say Frank Gore, not the fastest back in the stable. He's not going to be legging out those 80-yarders. He had a below average yards per carry. Doesn't mean he was a below average running back. It just means he didn't have the straight line speed of someone like Tatum Bell or Raheem Mostert. I like, there's a lot of great talented running backs, guys whose skills I believe in, who have just gotten unlucky on the yards per carry front so far. Breece Hall averaged like 4.8 over the first 2 years. He's second worst, just behind Gus Edwards with 3.0. That's not going to hold up. Bijan, I think, but he's kind of been underperforming what we expect from him. And so for me, I'm like, if I'm pretty confident a player is good, but he hasn't been producing commensurate to that ability, I'm going to bet on him rebounding. That's a pretty easy bet for me to make. It gets a little bit circular because how I estimate if a player is good or not is often pretty highly correlated to if he's productive or not.
Right.
So there's a very easy tendency for me to saying, well, he's not producing, so he's not good, so he's not going to produce.
Right.
That gets kind of circular. But by and large, there's guys who we know are good. Like, this is not that hard. We don't really need to question if Breece Hall is the best running back on the New York Jets. Like, no. He is. I get that it hasn't looked like it over the last month, but small samples are weird. He's going to rebound. He's going to be fine.
Yep.
Saquon Barkley is fantastic. He's very, very fast. He's got that straight line speed that you really need for high yards per carry. That one run he had a couple weeks ago where like he hit the second level and then like turned on the afterburners, like you get the age curve truthers who are like, he should have lost at least 2 steps there. Nope. Still's got all those steps still.
Yeah.
He's incredible, but he doesn't average 6 yards per carry for his career. He's not going to average 6 yards per carry the rest of the way either.
No, but but I wouldn't be surprised at all if he's averaging 5 by the end of the year.
No.
Or
that would be more
in
line with. Yeah, that would be more in line with his historical averages. Yeah, that's pretty reasonable. I'm not saying he's going to be a scrub. He's probably going to be one of the top 3 or 4 fantasy backs this year. At this point, it's looking incredibly likely that that's the case, barring injury. But like him and Derrick Henry, they're incredible backs. I think there's a good shot both of them make the Hall of Fame someday.
Yeah.
But they're also averaging 6 yards per carry. These two things can both be true, that yes, they are incredible. Yes, they are among the best running backs in the entire NFL. And yes, they've been overproducing to this point, and we shouldn't necessarily expect that overproduction to be sustainable going forward. I would expect a moderate decline in performance from both of them.
And I'll add J.K. Dobbins to that list as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
Great back, fantastic story. Love seeing that story, given all that he's been through and all he's had come to get here. It's really funny seeing Edwards and Dobbins in the Chargers and how divergent their performance has been after watching them both in Baltimore, and how convergent their performance was. Like, that was always the thing. Like, why do you care about Dobbins when Edwards gets you the same numbers? And now, like, it couldn't possibly be more different. But it's just randomness. Edwards is the guy he was. Dobbins is the guy he was. Or he's the guy he could have been had he stayed healthy. And
I think I'll give you a guy that I think might actually, like, have a kind of more, will have a little bit more growth. Right now he's averaging 4.1 yards per carry, and that's Rico Dowdle. I know that people are down, and I think it's just because he's starting to emerge as the guy that's going to get the most touches in that backfield and has become the more reliable, at least on the short term. So he's someone that I would probably take a cheap bet on if I could, to be able to lean on him a little bit moving forward. Whereas like Tank Bigsby, who's I believe is probably in the same range of player right now, maybe a little bit higher up, but he's like been running back 8 recently. After watching his games, I would say, Bigsby's ranked 37th right now in PPR. Dowdle is 27th. I'll take Dowdle over Bigsby, even though Bigsby's the hot name, mainly because Bigsby's averaging 8 yards per carry. There's some big runs for sure, but also just from analyzing his game, he's like fool's gold as an interior runner. Like, he is better as an interior runner than Travis Etienne. So teams that are weak against the run up the middle, he's gonna look good at, because he's gonna pop one run that's gonna get him a big play. And he has just enough burst to do that. He finds cutbacks, but he's still not an extremely intelligent runner between the tackles, and you see those mistakes show up on the field. And he's a screen pass player. He's not a space threat in the way that Etienne is. And Etienne still looks good out in space like that. So the next 3 games are going to look really good for Tank Bigsby, because he's facing teams that aren't that great up the middle. So to me, you're going to see that value rise for the next 2 to 3 weeks. And then if you don't trade him before that Packers game, you might want to sit him. You might find yourself wishing you sat him a couple of the times that after that, where he faces like Philadelphia's stout middle. And you see that more of these defenses that he's going to face are going to be better for Etienne to be the focus of the run game, or at least getting the ball to that type of back out of the backfield. And you might have to wait on Bigsby a little bit while longer. So he's a guy that I think is going to regress, and then looking at maybe some other backs here. I mean, I think Hall is obviously is a great obvious answer from that standpoint. Dowdle, someone I think could grow for sure. I'm thinking that Bucky Irving, we're going to see that drop a little bit more, and I think you're going to see the same thing kind of play out, where they figure out the roles between him and Rachaad White. Neither of them are great backs, but they both complement each other well, and see some of where that goes. I mean, guys, if I were going to go to, like, say, wide receiver, the one I'm most interested in seeing is Alec Pierce, because Alec Pierce is clearly he's averaging 28 yards per catch. We know that's going to go down. I mean, that's obvious. But is it going to go down to where we think he's going to become an irrelevant fantasy player in, say, a 3 wide receiver format? And I kind of believe, from what I'm seeing, that there's a chance that he won't. that he may actually remain a viable player, because watching the guy that they keep talking about, that every fantasy analyst I hear keeps talking about, is A.D. Mitchell, the rookie. And after watching A.D. Mitchell this year, the numbers say, oh, he's getting great separation and his targets are strong and he's out targeting, Pierce. But when I watch the quality of that, and we'll see if it plays out this way, sometimes it doesn't, but A.D. Mitchell, he's falling down a lot on routes. Like, I watch him slip, like, in multiple games. I've seen him drop passes in multiple games. A lot of rookie kind of mistakes. And I look at someone like Pierce, and he's not making any mistakes. He's making few mistakes. And he's also making a higher grade of difficulty type of play on a regular basis. And he's had two quarterbacks that are coming to trust him. And when you see them start to trust in big play moments or in the fourth quarter of games, and it's not like they're going to just take away one play, and that, because I saw something where somebody was talking about, well, if we take away, their teams are just going to, take away that play that Alec Pierce is making. He's not making all his plays on one play. It's not like, he's going to be found out that way. He is used a lot in the deep game, but there's various ways he's getting open, and they're getting him open. And a lot of the things he's doing are of a higher difficulty. So he's someone that I think will obviously regress, but I think may actually hold enough value to remain a good player. I think Amari Cooper we will probably see his value rise. He's only averaging 10 yards per catch, but I think that Jameis Winston's coming. And I think if there's a guy that you can count on to like force feed a receiver who runs good routes and still has a vertical game left, it's probably Jameis. Jameis will make enough mistakes that it might drive the Browns fans crazy, but Amari Cooper's going to get his opportunities and probably will convert them as a result of that. And so that's a guy who's been kind of playing all year that I think people will probably feel pretty good about from that standpoint. And I think we may also look at someone like, maybe off the bat, I think Brian Thomas, we're going to see a regression with Brian Thomas. As much as I like his game, I think he's probably going to be more of a low-end wide receiver too by the time it's all over. I would say that Marvin Harrison, we're going to see the same thing, that we're going to see a regression, even though he's 18th, and people will go, well, what if he builds? But again, I don't think 16.4 yards per catch is going to be sustainable for him. And if it is, the volume's still going to be low then if he's going to be sustaining that number. And watching him play, the issues are there. He makes good catches, but there are certain types of catches that are the difference between him and Malik Neighbors or him and Jamar Chase that he does not make, and he doesn't have the quarterback to do that either. So I think that this is a guy that you don't want to be betting on a climb for him. I think you're going to be betting on him probably being a wide receiver, low-end wide receiver 2, high-end wide receiver 3. Whereas with Tyreek Hill, I mean, as long as Tua comes back, that's a pretty easy one too for us to look at.
Yeah, it's funny because I promise you I'm going to find myself in a position down the road where I'm banging on a climb from Marvin Harrison Jr. just because I do every year. I note that rookies tend to produce more in the second half than in the first half. So right. I'm like, here's all rookie wide receivers. I bet you as a group they produce more. But yeah, he's probably less likely to climb than some of the other rookie wide receivers. And I'm glad you mentioned Brian Thomas because I also, I really like Brian Thomas. I feel like if you're saying that like everybody you like, their production is sustainable and everybody you don't like, their production is unsustainable, that's not analysis. That's like fan fiction. Sometimes guys I like overproduce too. It's very rare. Usually it's an indication that I was right all along. But on very rare occasions, it has been known that they have been, getting a little bit lucky or playing a little bit above their heads. I'd throw Jaden Reed out there as a guy who I really like. Jaden
Me
Reed.
too.
He's such a fun receiver.
Yeah.
And I've been in on Jaden Reed since his rookie year, like since before he hit the field. But he's not going to keep producing like he's producing. I'm not saying it's smoke and mirrors. He's got genuine skill that's leading to this, but this is not the sort of production that you're going to get week in and week out. He's not going to keep hitting big plays like this. I
think Reed is a top 15 player, but I can understand your argument about not being a top 5 player, because he's going to get he's going to win multiple ways like Debo, because they use him like that. But the 19.7 yards per average is going away pretty quickly.
Yeah, that's not compared to somebody like Rashid Shaheed. Like, this is his game, is getting that huge yards per reception average. Yeah. Jaden Reed can do the deep stuff, but he's not like a one trick deep shot pony where that's going to hold up. You know, but I love him. It's not going to hold up. I always have to laugh, like, every time I look at Wan'Dale Robinson's stat line.
Yeah.
Because I think he's like the newest character in the Disney canon, because this is beyond Mickey Mouse. It's now its own thing.
Yeah.
Like the way they're using him. It's I don't know. It's so funny to see because there's not a whole lot of like precedent for like this kind of usage. So in some respects, theoretically, it is sustainable. Like, I'm sure defenses are happy to say, like, if you want to keep dumping these low upside passes off to Wan'Dale Robinson, like, we can live with that. We'll let you do that. That's fine. We'd rather you do that than take more shots down at Neighbors. But it's just such weird volume that at some point the Giants are going to be like, all right, this is just junk food. This is just empty calories. Let's eat a little bit more veggies and a little bit fewer Cheetos, and Wan'Dale's usage will probably go down, which is it. Normally I say usage is what you want to follow. Like, the usage is sticky. The efficiency is noise. But it's very empty calories. And I think the Giants are going to start eating more veggies at some point. So I would not rely on Wan'Dale, the PR god Robinson, keeping up that insane target rate.
Especially if Darius Slayton showed up last week in replacement of Malik Neighbors enough that they can look at that and go, maybe we can do a little bit with both those outside guys. But safe guys in the top 20 that are going to go up. I mean, come on. Amon-Ra St. Brown. Yeah, I think that's happening. Garrett Wilson.
And
Laporta. Yep. But
I tend to think that Detroit offense will be more St. Brown and Laporta, less Jameson Williams. I mean, like, to this point, it's been like Jameson Williams has been the haymaker, and then St. Brown and Laporta have been the counterpunches. Whereas I think long run, I tend to feel like Jamo's more the counterpunch in that offense.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's exactly what will happen, because defenses have to get wise to that. It was like Chase Claypool going off in Pittsburgh in year one and just getting free money, kind of getting free parking all the time. And then after about week 6, week 7, teams started adjusting, and then they started sliding over to him first, and that opened things up for Juju and Deontay Johnson a little bit more, and Chase Claypool's value plummeted. I don't think Williams' value is going to plummet to the point that Chase Claypool's did, but it's certainly, you'll see a little bit more of a correction. And I think, in addition to that, Garrett Wilson, I know that everyone's going off about the Jets and all of that, but when hasn't people gone off about Aaron Rodgers, even when he was in Green Bay? Like, there was always concern. You always hear, I still remember him telling people to relax, about bad starts. And I think he's the type of person that tends to, run his mouth in the media and get people upset. But he's a conflict-oriented person. And I think that we need to understand, because I think Amy Trask, the former GM of the Raiders, brought this up yesterday on X, and she was talking about how, the Bo Nix, Sean Payton dust up on the sideline this weekend, and how, Sean, there was a good resolution to all that, but people were all up in arms in different ways about it. And I was just stating that most people don't handle conflict well. and are uncomfortable seeing it, and they project their own fears onto conflict. When other people, conflict is just a part of life, and like it would be healthier if we just looked at conflict as just a phase of life, and don't attach as much emotion to it, and just go, look, we're going to disagree about things, and sometimes it's going to get spirited, and sometimes people get angry, and they're going to be passionate about what they say, and they may say some things that they don't really mean or put a little extra spin on it that they shouldn't. But if you have a good relationship, that gets resolved. You say your apologies where you need to, as long as you're not being like an abusive human being the way you say. You just might say something that hurts someone's feelings, and you go, look, I didn't mean it with that level of intensity or with this type of thing, or to say it that way. But I'll try and work on that. But I was just pissed off. Or you're in a setting where nobody really cares. Like you can say things to each other that you might not say to your spouse, but you would say it in this work setting. And I think that that's the kind of thing that people don't realize. So when you look at, you can look at Bo Nix and see that, but you can also look at Aaron Rodgers. And I know that people put the meaning into what his whole thing with Robert Saleh at the sideline might be, and maybe there's something there with that for sure. I mean, I think there's enough emotional intelligence to look at maybe there was a bigger problem there, especially now we're seeing it in hindsight. But I think the bigger issue is that Aaron Rodgers is a conflict-oriented personality. You can just see it on TV, and he doesn't worry about having conflicts. That's just a part of how he comes to a part of his relationships with people. And so I think that like him and Garrett Wilson, like every week it looks like they're having a conflict, but they also look like, if you see him on the sideline 5 minutes later, they look like it's like a resolved conflict, that they feel better about it, like they figured out some things. So people can talk about how bad Aaron Rodgers is playing, and he's had some bad games, but I honestly think that there's enough with him and Wilson that they will figure it out, and I think Wilson's going to wind up having a much better second half, even if Devontae Adams comes to town, because Adams still may know the offense, but it's not the exact same play calls, I would imagine, that they had in Green Bay, in terms of like the terminology is probably not exactly the same. There may still be some differences there, and also if there isn't, he's still having to like go back to what he remembered from something that he's been using a different set of terminology for a few years now. So Wilson's a guy that certainly fits that bill for me. DJ Moore, I still think has a time to climb. Guys who are just stable, like Mike Evans and Chris Godwin, I feel pretty good about where they're at. They may flip-flop by the time the year's over, but they're still in the same tier, one may be at the top of this tier of the top 12. The other may be at the bottom end of it. But I think that those are guys that if you're looking at Amon-Ra St. Brown, Garrett Wilson, DJ Moore, Mike Evans, CeeDee Lamb, Chris Godwin, those are safe plays. I don't think you're going to have to worry about too much of a dipper or rise. Yeah.
So yeah, all that extra work in your process, and it basically boils down to mine. That the good players will probably be fine, and the bad players probably won't. Yeah,
my only exception would be
me
Pierce.
With extra steps.
Yeah, only is I kind of want to bet on Pierce from what I've seen, in terms of him like being that guy that drops but doesn't drop too far.
Yeah, I mean, he could easily be like a Rashid Shaheed, I think, who's kind of historically been that similar profile, but in a very sustainable way. Yeah. Regarding Rodgers, I always say, in an environment with very intense selective pressures, like in the NFL, like the selective pressures are intense. Anybody who is thriving, not just succeeding, but absolutely thriving in that environment, you can assume that whatever traits they have, those are very adaptive. Those are very useful traits for where they are. It always got me, like, people would go off on Odell Beckham for being a diva.
Yeah.
And they're like, oh, he'd be so much better if he wasn't a diva. Probably not. I mean, he's a fantastic wide receiver. Pretty much everything about him, in order to get to that level of success, pretty much everything about him has to be working to his benefit. If you've got something holding you back, you don't become a superstar like that. And different people will succeed in different ways. Barry Sanders did that whole, like, it doesn't even matter that I just scored a touchdown, which we all know, that was just part of the mystique.
Right.
He cared about scoring that touchdown.
Of course he did.
Like, that was his touchdown celebration, was casually handing it to the ref. That's him. Yeah. That's how
that was like his baller move,
Right, absolutely. Like, I'm so much better than you that I don't even think twice about having scored this touchdown, right? Like, that's his celebration. But that was adaptive for him, whereas like other players we've seen be much more visibly emotive, and that was adaptive for them. And like Aaron Rodgers doing all this crazy stuff, like you can think about whatever you think about it personally. Like I wouldn't want him, like I don't want to hang out with him after work and grab a beer. He's not the type of person where that seems like a fun way to spend an afternoon. But I think all of this crazy Aaron Rodgers-ness probably contributes a large part to what makes him what he is today. Like the guys who, Tom Brady, like having that, I'm sure he has like on his mirror the name of every quarterback that was drafted ahead of him. He's going to have that when he's like 72 years old. He's going to wake up every morning and be like, I can't believe they took this guy over
Amon-Ra has a book apparently that he wrote every name down, and he reads it before every game.
Good for him. I mean,
Michael Jordan.
Honestly, I feel like that's not necessarily conducive to having a happy life,
right?
But I think it's probably conducive to Amon-Ra being like an absolutely devastating wide receiver. So yeah, I don't really get into. There's a lot of like prescriptive, like, oh, players should be like this, they shouldn't be like this, and especially over like, not like technique, like. You can say like, oh, he should have a better hands technique. I feel like that can be on sound basis, but you can say things like, oh, he should just shake off that last play and move on. Like, no.
Yeah.
The players are going to find what works for them, and that's fine.
And you can compartmentalize these behaviors. I mean, so, that's the other thing you got to remember is like, maybe Amon-Ra St. Brown has a book where he holds a grudge, and he uses this as motivation for that. But in the rest of his life, he doesn't remotely do anything like that. This is where he knows where to apply it to push his own buttons without it damaging the rest of his relationships with other people that are meaningful. And some people, they have to learn that or develop that, and they may do that a little too much early in their lives and it bleeds into other things, and then they realize, okay, I can only focus it in this way. But that's part of where that comes from. I talked to a former player this summer, and he was talking about, I said, so what's it like not playing anymore where you used to like sack people for a living? Like, what's that like to be like a citizen who doesn't get to like hit people and get all that energy out? Because you're like a pretty mild-mannered dude. Like I know you, and I know you're a pretty mild-mannered guy. But when you talk about playing the game, like your eyes kind of glaze over a little bit, and it's kind of like the way people project about murderers when they're when they're interviewing them, going, you could just see the evil in their eyes. And I always laugh when I see these crime shows and people go, I interviewed him, and you could just tell he was evil. It was just, I'm
with
like,
the full benefit of hindsight, I can predict everything.
Bullshit, you can. Like, I mean, come on now. I mean, it's just so funny. And there are people that look strange and off, but there's other reasons for why that might be, and a lot of them are not evil, or capable of, or have ever done anything of that great evil. But I would ask him that, and he said it's tough. Like, honestly, it's tough. I don't really have an outlet for it. And there are moments that I have where I'm like, I wish I did. I'm like, you need to get like a heavy bag, dude. Like, you need to get a heavy bag and maybe get into boxing or something where you can hit something every once in a while. And he's like, I've actually thought about that a lot, he said, because I've compartmentalized it, but I don't have an outlet for it anymore. And there's times that I end up going out in my car and like screaming because it's like I don't have anything else for this. So I've got to figure out a way to do it so that it doesn't just boil over into everything else. But I mean, that's just kind of part of this. And I mean, people are complicated, and I guess that kind of does bleed into our final topic, is that, we've talked about historical players, over the past few weeks. So I just decided, whose birthday is it today? And I looked up on Pro Football Reference, and sure enough, at the bottom of the list was Brett Lorenzo Favre, who was my player to defend the planet about 10, 12 years ago in the RSP exercise that we did to pick teams to defend the planet. And I kind of thought to myself, is he still the player that I would want to be my quarterback to defend the planet? And I'm kind of almost thinking more so than ever as we look at the way defenses are, and that a lot of quarterbacks don't read defenses that well, and the toughness factor of the game has amped down a little bit. I mean, it's still a tough game, but it's not as punishing as it was on quarterbacks. And then I think too, like if you've watched Game of Thrones, you look at like Tyrion Lannister and Bran saying, when they're deciding who's going to be their king, and then Bran decides to say, well, then you're going to be my hand. And he said, no, you don't want me. I've made too many mistakes. And Grey Worm basically says, no, you can't have him. He needs to be punished. And he said he is. He's about to serve his punishment and make payment for that. So I figure for all the people out there who don't like what happened in terms of Brett Favre and what's going on with the welfare scam and what happened in Mississippi or whatever you think, you can view it, for me, I kind of view it as, well, maybe he gets a chance to defend the planet. That might be punishment enough with the aliens that are coming, in the scenario that we had. But, he's a complicated player, and I just wondered what you think about his legacy as a player, and what do you think about, you seem like you and I kind of are on the same page. It's like you can kind of compartmentalize the people who are historical figures or have a legacy in terms of what they did well and whether you like them or not.
Yeah, I mean, I've thought and talked a lot about this over the years. So there's a guy named Jim Tyrer. Tyrer was an offensive tackle for the Kansas City Chiefs during the AFC years into their merger into the NFL. Far and away the best offensive lineman who's not currently in the Hall of Fame. He was probably maybe the second best offensive lineman in the AFL. Maintained that production after the merger. Was a many-time All-Pro. I think he had 6 All-Pros, the most All-Pros of any player who's not in the Hall of Fame. Sure, easy slam dunk Hall of Fame case. He's not in the Hall of Fame today. Reason why is because 4 years
Jake,
after he retired, he came home one day, killed his wife with his kids in the house, and then committed suicide. And so he came up for Hall of Fame consideration that first year of eligibility, and he was a finalist that year. And he's never even made it to the semifinalist stage since. I imagine it's plainly obvious what happened is he got to that finalist stage because they wanted to talk about him, and everybody in the room sat down and said, we're not seriously going to put Jim Tyrer in the Hall of Fame, are we? Clearly as a player, he's deserving. And I know Hall of Fame bylaws say that, we aren't supposed to consider off the field stuff. We're only supposed to consider play on the field, but we're not really going to put a guy who killed his wife in the house while his kids were in the house. We're not going to put him in the Hall of Fame. No. Okay. Of course we're not going to put him in. Peter King tried to make this point decades later with Darren Sharper, and I'm like, don't use Darren Sharper for the example, because for a lot of reasons. I'm getting sidetracked there, but Tyrer's the example where clearly, unequivocally, play on the field, clear Hall of Famer. And also he did this horrible, reprehensible thing. Nobody wants to condone that, and so he's not in. And I get that, on the surface, that seems like a very good standard. No murderers in the Hall of Fame. But the reality is, if you're looking at it probabilistically, there's a decent chance there's a murderer in the Hall of Fame already. I mean, you look at
yeah, there probably is.
I mean, and there's okay. I'm gonna name 4 names.
Yep.
There's Tyrer. Tyrer definitely, absolutely, 100% killed his wife. No question about it whatsoever. Yeah. We have O.J. Simpson. You guys can litigate that all you want, but there is a very, very strong chance that O.J. Simpson murdered 2 people. I mean, completely non-trivial chance.
Yep.
Marvin Harrison. I don't know if people followed Marvin Harrison, but after his career was over, there was some really sketchy stuff about, somebody was killed outside of a business he owned, and the gun was kind of linked to Harrison, and there was a witness who was going to testify him, and then that witness just died under mysterious circumstances, and there's a lot of smoke there that like maybe Harrison killed the guy, maybe a member of Harrison's entourage killed the guy, maybe this is all just a weird coincidence and this stuff just happened, and who knows, you know, it was South Philly, maybe stuff happens. But there's like a non-zero chance that Marvin Harrison has killed a guy. And then Ray Lewis. Yep. I don't think Ray Lewis, there's pretty like almost trivially low chance, but like I think he was involved with something. We never really know what happened in 2000, and we do know that he definitely to have helped cover up and impede the investigation into what happened in 2000. Yeah. So we have 4 players who can be accused with varying levels of credibility of having killed somebody.
That we know about, yes.
That we know about. And 3 of them are in the Hall of Fame, and Tyrer is not. Now, of the 4, I would say Tyrer was the worst of the 4 players. I think he was clearly Hall of Fame caliber, but Simpson, Harrison, Ray Lewis, strictly based on their play on the field, these are not just Hall of Famers. These are inner circle Hall of Famers. Yeah. These are, in some cases, Rushmore level players at their position. And then also, in terms of like the credibility of the accusation of murder, Tyrer absolutely positively 100%, no question, no argument, killed his wife. Yeah. That's not up for debate. So one could propose some sort of balancing test that like a certain probability of murder sets like a certain amount of talent where like if you're good enough, you can maybe 80% have killed somebody and still make the Hall of Fame. Whereas no, he wasn't good enough. We can only put him in with like a 20% chance. And it's gross. It like ethically, like it's a really gross thing to discuss, but that's kind of the reality of the situation. I mean, we can never say you could put in Tom Brady and you can never say with like 100.0000000% certainty that like Tom Brady has never killed anybody. I'm not saying Tom Brady's killed anybody, although like I've seen that look in his eyes where like he's like, I'm going to do whatever it takes. And you know, like I think all NFL players have to be sociopaths to some degree, all successful ones at any rate.
There are players who have done some pretty nasty things or have been rumored to do some pretty nasty things that if it ever came out, their legacies would probably be ruined, extremely tarnished. Right. But we're going to celebrate them because nobody really knows for sure about some of this, or the ones who do, or even sometimes testified.
We do know for sure, right? Like we know Jim Brown was kind of a morally reprehensible person, just in terms of like his treatment towards women, and we also know that he was a civil rights icon. Larry Fitzgerald, people forget about this, credibly accused of domestic violence very early in his career, and now he's got this like choir boy image. You know, Peyton Manning sexually assaulted a woman in college at Tennessee, and I mean, I don't want to get into the position where I'm excusing bad behavior, but it's also important to recognize that like some bad behavior, I mean, it's not excusable, but it's explainable. You know, I think that like a 18 or 19-year-old man, technically, but still child behaving reprehensibly is less an indictment than a 32-year-old man behaving reprehensibly. I'm not excusing the behavior, but I'm saying that like people are dumber, their frontal lobes are not fully developed. They're more likely to do that shit when they're 17, 18, 19.
And and then there's also just the point that we don't always in that case we knew before he even entered his career what happened, but there are times that we bring, you know, that people come in, society standards changed, our norms evolve, things like that. I mean, to bring your Tyrer point up, I would almost say if we're gonna like talk about it from a very theoretical standpoint, I'm not saying this is what I believe. I'm just posing an argument theoretically for people to understand and take this kind of way out there. But one way you could say theoretically is you could say, well, you know what? For people who, if we're going to really live by the rule of the letter of what we say, which is we want Hall of Fame players to be enshrined who were worthy of the Hall of Fame, then we'd enshrine everybody, no matter what it was that they did, and and then maybe what you do differently is you don't give them the yellow jacket. You don't invite, they're not, their families and they're not allowed at the ceremony. There's not going to be any type of pomp or circumstance regarding their enshrinement. They're just going to be there, like their bust will be there to be seen, and their play will be chronicled, but there won't be any ceremony involving these people. I'm not saying that's the right answer, but I would say if you were going to do that, maybe that's the solution. That's one possible solution or direction of that solution, where you just go, no, you're not. No one's going up there to make a speech for him. No one's going up there. No one's putting a jacket on him. We're just going to say, yep, he's enshrined because of his accomplishments in the game, and we're just going to leave it at that for the sake of history. Just in the same way that we chronicle history, good and bad. You would look at it as a chronicler of history, but because it's entertainment, people want to like the people that entertain them, and that's the problem.
Right. I mean, I don't think that's a workable standard either. In terms of like, if you have a Hall of Fame where you're like, we're actively going to celebrate murder, it's like the Hall of Fame is a product ultimately, and you're selling to an audience.
Yeah.
I don't know. The tire example is interesting too, because it gets further complicated. You look back with the benefit of hindsight, and what we know about head injuries, chronic head injuries, CTE, especially for offensive linemen. I would say that of the four names I named who had some involvement with a murder that we know about, Tyre's was the least premeditated of them. His was the one that I think most clearly exhibited hallmarks of brain damage.
It's like Chris Benoit, the wrestler who killed his wife and his child, and they did an examination of his brain, and it was riddled with CTE. So.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, like he maybe Jim Tyre was just a mean asshole, right? And maybe he was a sociopath, and maybe he could have gone on and been a shoe salesman, and he still would have done this thing, because people without CTE do this terrible, horrible thing still. It's not this. I'm not offering this by way of explanation, but I do think there's very plausible chance that this was a contributing factor, that CTE's been known to give you depression. It's been known to impair short-term judgment and make people act more impulsively. And this was a impulsive act from a depressed man. So it's hard too for me to say that we're not going to like football is not going to honor the contributions of a man because he did a bad thing because of the results of him playing football. That seems even more hypocritical.
Right.
That football plausibly contributed to this outcome and then is washing its hands of it. It's a very complicated case. And I have a lot of friends and we talk about Hall of Fame stuff. And this is one of those where like there's some guys where like Randy Gradisher, if you don't think he's a Hall of Famer, you should have your Hall of Fame vote revoked. Like this one, there should not be a discussion about it. Whereas I think you can absolutely make good faith arguments on either side of the Tyre issue. It's not a clear cut issue. Me personally, I would put him in, but I recognize that it's a complicated thing, and I would try to do it in a way that was respectful to. I mean, there's living people who are impacted by this horrible thing that he did, and but I think it's okay to recognize that it's complicated and to have conflicting feelings about something.
Yeah.
And the reality is we live in a society where as much as we only want to support good people, it's just not possible the way that society is structured. I say that like people are fundamentally good, I think. And our boss at Footballguys, Joe Bryant, I think he's a great example of this. He, over this last week, Footballguys did this promotion. They raised $30,000 to donate to food banks for people who were impacted by the hurricane in North Carolina, because he felt, he has connections to that area. He lives in Knoxville, Tennessee. He's very deeply connected to that area and the community. And he felt that it wasn't really getting the attention and the recognition, and he wanted to do something about it. And he's a good guy. And I think most people in the world are Joe Bryants to some degree or another. They're out there and they want to do the right thing. They want to do what's right and make the world a better place. And I think most companies are run by Joe Bryants. But I also think that most of the times we as a consumer interact with a company, we are interacting with an immoral or unethical company, because companies run by Joe Bryant's, they don't achieve this global massive scale, right? Like if Joe Bryant was in charge of Amazon, they never would have been the giant powerhouse that they are. Because to get as big as Amazon is, you need to do some shady shit. You need to be willing to do, because if you don't, there's going to be another potential Amazon out there that is, and they're going to put you out of business. So at a certain scale, I think just as a first approximation, any corporation entity of any sufficient size, I just assume is probably sociopathic. I don't think it's immoral. I don't think it's actively trying to do evil. I just think it doesn't care about questions of good or evil. It cares about growth. And it's going to do some evil stuff in the name of that growth along the way. And we can, as consumers, say, I don't want to support an organization that's doing that. But realistically, we can't live in this society without making some choices. I felt that the NCAA was too exploitative. I think it's exploiting the players. And I think it's making a lot of bad faith arguments to keep that gravy train rolling. And at some point I said, this is too much for me. I can't support it anymore. And so I haven't watched a snap of NCAA sports in, 12, 13 years now. I think the NFL is also exploitative. You look at we're talking about CTE, the NFL actively fought a lot of that research and tried to minimize it and downplay it. And then eventually we're dragged kicking and screaming into, okay, well, we're going to set up this fund for previous players who are dealing with these impacts, but then did some really gross stuff with like race norming to avoid paying out players who deserved it. And they've done a lot of like really sketchy shit. I mean, I don't think the NFL is an ethical organization by any sense either. For me, the calculus was, I think the NCAA is slightly more unethical than the NFL, and I like the NFL significantly more than the NCAA. So I still support the NFL. I mean, I make my living off of the back of the NFL, and I don't watch college football. And to some extent, that makes me hypocritical. I wouldn't blame anybody who made the principled stand and said, I will continue to support both. I wouldn't blame anybody who made the principled stand to support neither. I wouldn't blame anybody who continued to support the NCAA, but not the NFL. These are questions, I think, without obvious, clear-cut answers, and everybody needs to decide for themselves where their lines are. And I'm not really ever going to blame anybody for where they draw that line, because I think it's a very personal thing without there's no real objective parameters we can use. And there's no way to be 100% ethical and only support good moral causes in this world. That's just not the way that our world is constructed anymore. And it hasn't been that way for a long time. And I don't want to advocate nihilism and say that, well, since it's impossible to be perfectly ethical, we should no longer care about ethics at all. I'm not saying people should have no line, but I'm not going to argue with where people choose to draw that line. And for me, someone like Brett Favre, it's very easy for me to separate Brett Favre the player from Brett Favre the person. Yeah, and I can be a fan of Brett Favre the player while still thinking that, Brett Favre the person is a sociopath who did reprehensible things and deserves very serious consequences for that.
Yeah, and I kind of look at it this way. A lot of what you said I would sum up in a very probably in a too simplistic of a way, but I would say people suck, but I love individuals. And from the standpoint of that, when you do have when you have a mass group of people trying to govern something, that you end up with that bureaucratic kind of faceless, emotionless, moralityless type of organization that can be helpful as a machine when the tool's used in a way that's favorable, but also can unintentionally or intentionally do a lot of harm. And so that's where people, I think, suck, because it's just the outcome of having, that many voices involved or that many people involved, and it becomes less
that
personal.
Many different directions to distribute blame.
Yes.
Where it's never my fault. It's only like 2% my fault.
Yeah.
And you distribute that 2% blame across 50 different people, there's still 100% blame, but all of them are feeling like I did 98% the right thing here. Like I'm not to blame.
Exactly. Whereas with an individual, you know, we love redemption stories, and we love people who say I was wrong.
Unless you're Ray Rice.
Unless you're Ray Rice. Yeah, exactly. I was wrong. I made a mistake, and you know, let's move forward. And that's exactly right. And it's a lot of it's the image of things. I mean, if we saw a video of what Tyreek Hill did, you know, you would, you know, not that we want to have a suffering Olympics, but we know the realities of how people look at things. If you saw what Tyreek Hill did to a pregnant woman, you know, or Dede Westbrook, you know, neither of them would have ever had a chance to play in the NFL. They would have not remotely had a chance, you know. So, you know, it's one of those things that, you know, the optics of situations, fair or not, you know, can have such a huge influence. But yeah, people are complicated, and it is a problematic thing. But yeah, I mean, I think that's why, you know, ultimately when people take stands on from fantasy, I'm the same way with drawing the line. It's like, you don't like Deshaun Watson, you don't like Jameis Winston. You know, it's hard for me to be, you know, being personal, it's hard for me to be a Browns fan. It's very hard for me to be a Browns fan right now. I have not watched a single Cleveland Browns game this year. And it's not because I've made like a moral point of it. I've just found other games that I've made the priority right now, and they're not playing well, and so it just hasn't been a priority yet to do. But you know, it's very hard for me to watch that team. Meanwhile, you know, but at the same time, I'm going to give analysis on why you should why you should be considering Jameis Winston soon, how that can impact the team, you know, those kinds of things. And if you are going to, and I'm not going to sit there and talk about that you shouldn't have Deshaun Watson on your team, at least at the beginning of the year, if you hope that he was going to be a good player, or you think that he's going to make a rebound with his performance. If you really believe that, you know, again, if you have an issue with that, the NFL is the wrong organization to be attacking with those things. And we do that reflexively. It should be one of those things where you go, listen, if you have a problem with guys who have been charged with certain crimes and they settled and they haven't been imprisoned and they haven't been found guilty of anything, you know, start looking around at law enforcement, start looking around at the court system, start thinking about what you're going to do there. Don't ask the NFL to do that. These guys have a right to work. And if there's a demand for their services, they're going to get paid. I mean, go look at some of you are in corporate America, and your VP of HR has probably had 3 or 4 DUIs and harassed women. And you know, he still has a job. And there are some places where that stuff has happened and where that stuff has existed. My wife has worked at places like that. I've worked at places like that. You know, I'm not citing anything specific with either of those, but like I've seen those types of things that have existed. So, you know,
it's like with Mike Vick. I mean, a lot of people had a very strong emotional reaction to what Mike Vick did because we love our dogs. You know, dogs are innocent, dogs and children, and people felt emotionally much different about what Mike Vick than like, you know, I think that. I love dogs. I think abusing a human is more reprehensible than abusing dogs.
But there are people who actually react more to dogs than they do kids.
Yeah,
I mean, which is
absolutely yeah. But and so there were a lot of people when Vic got back into the NFL where they're like, he should never be able to re-enter the NFL ever. Right. It should be a lifetime ban. And to some extent, I think as a society, our thought should be. I mean, in U.S., punishment is very punitive focused. Like the penal system is very focused on punishment, right? Rather than like
rehabilitation
best outcomes for us as a society. And if you get overly punitive, you get to a point, okay, well, Michael Vick can no longer participate in society. Eventually, you get enough people who are no longer able to participate in society, and you no longer have a society. I think that there has to be for everything, there has to be some re-entry point. Yeah. And maybe for some things, if a guy is like Jeffrey Dahmer, I think it's okay, like at that point, to say,
yeah, let's call it a day with his life. Yeah.
We're good with that. Yeah. Like, I'm okay if he's never a part of society again. We can go ahead and that doesn't bother me.
If he wants to contribute to society by helping the FBI catch other killers and do that from behind bars, great. But he doesn't need to.
We're not letting him back in with like, he's never going to get a job again. I'm okay with that. Yeah. Like he's not going to be able to go to the grocery store. I'm okay with that.
But for let's say a marijuana offense, where you get 20 years and all you've really learned is how to be in prison, and because no one's going to hire you for a job and give you the opportunities that you should have because they're being punitive and kind of protecting themselves as a mass group. Now all you're doing is funneling people back into being better criminals because that's the only choice they have is to be a better criminal. Not the only, but law of averages tell you that
those are the skills
the
that
easiest thing.
Right.
You're greasing the skids to make it much easier. So yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of focus on what people deserve. And I think questions of desert are very hard.
Yeah.
And just like with estimating my team's chances of winning a title, if I can get to an endpoint without doing the hard thing where I might get it wrong, I'm going to do that. I would rather focus on, what kind of society do we want to be? What's best for us as a society?
Yeah.
What's best? I think what's best for us as a society is if our entertainment leagues, the National Football League, is not like an investigative entity that we're turning to punish bad behavior.
Right.
Because I think it's best for society if like the legal system is in charge of punishing bad behavior and not just we're not relying on this ad hoc network of employers responding to outrage.
Because it creates a level of corruption that the potential for corruption that is completely unjust and applies pressure to other systems that should just be doing their job and look at someone and say, Roger Goodell, fuck you and all your money and everybody else's money. On top of that, we're doing this and your influence has nothing to do with it.
And also, like, outrage is not equally distributed. We're talking about how to make a fair and equal society. I'm probably not saying something that controversial for this podcast, but I think there are some actions that, if captured on video by somebody with a slightly different skin tone, would maybe evoke a slightly different response.
Yep.
And if we're relying on public outcry to apportion blame, we're going to reinforce a lot of inequitable systems.
Yeah.
And so maybe we shouldn't be punishing people by how mad the public is at any given moment. Maybe we shouldn't be judging, is Michael Vick fit to re-enter the NFL based on the opinion of dog lovers who think that dogs have more moral worth than children. Maybe we should have, in this country, like a body, a branch that like actually investigates wrongdoing and decides what we as a society want to do about it, rather than offshoring that blame to third parties, because as a country we're so dysfunctional that we can't come to that conclusion ourselves. And so we're just kind of abdicating the responsibility and letting sociopathic organizations like the NFL pick up the slack. And I say that very intentionally. If corporations are people, then corporations are sociopaths.
Yeah.
Sometimes people are sociopaths, but all corporations are sociopaths in the sense that like they don't have emotions. They don't have empathy. They're incapable of feeling the things that make us human. They don't have that emotional response or that moral logic or the things that make us what we are.
Yeah, it's for sure. And you're right. I mean, like, I think of the Joe Mixon situation that happened years ago while he was at Oklahoma, and I think was his action of hitting this woman in a restaurant wrong? Absolutely. No reason to do that at all. And I'm not saying the cause and effect here, but is it bad behavior for what the woman exhibited to be in his face and put her hands on him and to harass him, because that's what she was doing. Am I victim shaming her? No, but I am saying that she has to be responsible for her actions, and her actions shouldn't be to do that. And you also have to have some understanding of like that is also inappropriate behavior, that is damaging behavior. And if I was going to teach a child, male or female, how to behave, one of the things I would be saying is you don't do what she did without expecting that someone may not behave accordingly and turn the other cheek. That it's like you don't put your hand in the water when there's a great white shark with chum in the water. You don't do that, And I'm not saying that Joe Mixon is like some predator of a great white shark and inhuman, but I am saying that there is some cause and effect, and that sometimes you have to look at some of this behavior, and we can't look at this and say everyone was innocent in that interaction. Now, was her behavior warranting of the response? Absolutely not. It was awful. At the same time, if you can't look at me in the eye and say, I would teach my young lady to like put my hands on another individual and harass them the way that she did. You wouldn't do that. So there's some complexity with some of these things too, where we villainize people completely and without really assigning some level of accountability with other people in interactions. There are times where people are just completely are complete victims in the situation, and she was certainly a complete victim to the response that he gave, without a doubt. She's also someone who instigated a fight that didn't need to be happening. Like, she didn't need to be. This was where both of them needed to turn the other cheek, and so but we simplify it, and if you talk about that, people get upset, because they think, oh, you're victim shaming, and it's like, no, there's some nuance to some of these things.
Yeah. Vincent Jackson was suspended from the Chargers. He got 2 DUIs, and I would never advocate DUIs. One of my good friends in high school was orphaned her senior year when a drunk driver plowed into the car. She spent like the last 3 months of her senior year in the hospital recovering from this terrible accident from somebody who was driving drunk, or this collision from somebody who was driving drunk. And I'm not saying that it wasn't bad for Vincent Jackson to get a DUI, but also if you look at it, our entire society is basically structured around getting people to drive drunk. Where do restaurants make the most of their money? It's on alcohol sales.
Yeah.
What do you think people do after a restaurant? Like, do you think they walk home after going out and getting 3 beers? No. That restaurants, they want you to drink, and then they know you're going to drive home. At any given time, what's the estimate that like 50% of people after like a certain hour of the night have had something to drink, and so Vincent Jackson should not drive drunk. Nobody should drive drunk. This is a horrible thing. You're putting others around you at incredible risk. It's very reckless and irresponsible, but also I don't think, to me, it doesn't carry the same moral valence as like hitting another person, because we as a society have normalized it, and we've said this is not a thing that's like this horrible, evil thing. Like people don't think of it as something that's as bad as it's
tough
it's
because
complicated.
It's and I know you're not saying like drinking and driving's okay, but you're showing how like societally it greases the skids, that it's much easier for this outcome to happen. And if we wanted to prevent the outcome, one of the ways we would decrease that dramatically is that restaurants would not sell liquor,
Right.
or sell alcohol.
Or we build walkable neighborhoods.
Neighborhoods.
Gotta slip some urbanism in.
Exactly. There you go. That there are other solutions for sure. And I think that's, and I think from a certain degree, that is a salient point, and there, and it does, people ultimately have to avoid certain temptations and learn them. Know thyself. Go back to that, and learn the lessons to try and avoid behaviors where they're especially susceptible to making mistakes that could be that could impact other people's lives. In addition to their own. But it's just, again, it's complicated. So when we look at we look at this game that we have, it's a complicated game, but so is our society. So I think maybe the way we can end this today is just kind of point it out that it's like, it's a game for entertainment. But it's just a reflection of where we are in society, and we shouldn't expect anything simplistic from this game if it's a mirror to our society, because there are no easy answers. That's for sure. Well, we had a fun time being able to have this conversation. We appreciate you listening in, and of course you can email us where you can find or talk to us on X at Harstad, at Matt Waldman. And thank you again for listening, and you guys have a good week.